The Revelation Explained, Chapter 11, Part 2. 42 months, or 1260 days, are symbolic time, signifying 1260 years, during which time the power of apostasy was to reign supreme over the minds of men. The same period is also referred to frequently in subsequent chapters. It is necessary, then, for us to ascertain at what period of time the church was given over to a profane multitude that was not the true people of God. Some have supposed that this must refer to the time when popery became fully established. Such, however, could not be the case, although the time period includes that important event. For the power of apostasy was greatly developed centuries before the final supremacy of the popes, and was necessary in order to prepare the way for their exaltation. The popes, obtaining their authority by degrees. In AD 606, the Emperor Phocas conferred the title Universal Bishop upon the Pope of Rome. In AD 756, the Pope became a temporal sovereign. Yet, the power of papal usurpation did not reach the summit until the reign of the impious Hildebrand, who succeeded to the popedom in AD 1073, under the title of Gregory VII. But according to the symbols before us, we must look for a period not so much when the popes were enabled to definitely enforce their arrogant claims as when the ministry became corrupted and when the inhabitants of the city or the devotees of the visible church became a profane multitude entirely estranged from the covenant of promise. The usurpations of the ministry that accompanied this great change in the external church have been considered already under the symbols of chapter 6. This mighty transformation to a church containing nothing but uncircumcised Gentiles was fully accomplished during the latter half of the 3rd century, from which date we must look for the true disciples of the Lord as entirely separate from the hierarchy. A few quotations from standard and ecclesiastical histories will show this important epoch in the rise of the papacy that plunged the world into almost universal apostasy. Quote, "The living church retiring gradually within the lonely sanctuary of a few solitary hearts. An external church was substituted in its place, and all its forms were declared to be of divine appointment. Salvation no longer flowing from the Word, which was henceforward put out of sight. The priests affirmed that it was conveyed by means of the forms they had themselves invented, and that no one could obtain it but by these channels. The doctrine of the Church and the necessity of its visible unity, which had begun to gain ground in the 3rd century, favored the pretensions of Rome." End quote from D. Albing's History of the Reformation, Book 1, Chapter 1. Another quote, "At the end of the 3rd century, almost half the inhabitants of the Roman Empire and of several neighboring countries professed the faith of Christ. About this time, endeavors to preserve a unity of belief and of church discipline occasioned numberless disputes among those of different opinions and led to the establishment of an ecclesiastical tyranny." End quote from Encyclopedia of Religious Knowledge. Concerning the Roman diocese, the Encyclopaedia Britannica states, quote, "Before the termination of the 3rd century, the office was held to be of such importance that its succession was a matter of interest to ecclesiastics living in distant seas." End quote. From volume 19, page 488. Another quote. "Almost proportionate with the extension of Christianity was the decrease in the church of vital piety. A philosophizing spirit among the higher and a wild monkish superstition among the lower orders fast took the place in the 3rd century of the faith and humility of the first Christians. Many of the clergy became very corrupt and excessively ambitious. In consequence of this, there was an awful defection of Christianity." End quote. From Marsh's Church History, page 185. Another quote. "We have found it almost necessary to separate and indeed widely to distinguish the events of the 2 first from those of the 3rd century, for nearly at this point we are disposed to place the first crisis in the internal history of the Church." End quote. From Waddington's Church History. Another quote. "This season of external prosperity was improved by the ministers of the Church for the exertion of new claims, and the assumption of powers with which they had not been previously invested. At first these claims were modestly urged, and gradually allowed, but they laid a foundation for the encroachments which were afterwards made upon the rights of the whole Christian community, and for lofty pretensions to the right of supremacy and spiritual dominion. Several alterations in the form of church government appear to have been introduced during the 3rd century. Some degree of pomp was thought necessary. The external dignity of the ministers of religion was accompanied by a still greater change in its discipline. Many of the Jewish and pagan proselytes languished in the absence of ceremonies which were naturally adapted to the taste of the unreflecting multitude, while the insolent infidel haughtily insisted upon the inanity of a religion which was not manifested by an external symbol or decoration. In order to accommodate Christianity to these prejudices, a number of rites were instituted, and while the dignified titles of the Jewish priesthood were through a compliance with the prejudices of that people, conferred upon the Christian teachers, many ceremonies were introduced which coincided with the genius of paganism. The true Gospels were taught by sensible images, and many of the ceremonies employed in celebrating the heathen mysteries were observed in the institutions of Christ, which soon, in their turn, obtained the name of mysteries, and served as a melancholy precedent for future innovations, and as a foundation for that structure of absurdity and superstition which deformed and disgraced the Church." End quote. From Rutter's History of the Church, page 52 through 56. This season of external prosperity, mentioned by Rutter, began with the accession of Gallienus to the imperial throne in A.D. 260. Up to this time, the hand of persecution had been raised against the Church almost incessantly. But from 260 until the reign of Diocletian, persecution almost ceased. During this space of about 40 years. But this period also marked the greatest decline in spiritual things and a marvelous development of the hierarchy. Speaking of the Bishop of Rome in these times, Dowling says, quote, "He far surpassed all his brethren in the magnificence and splendor of the church over which he presided, in the riches of his revenues and possessions, in the number and variety of his ministers, in his credit with the people, and in his sumptuous and splendid manner of living." End quote, from History of Romanism, page 34. This ends chapter 11, part 2.